first scholar to give a rigorous conceptual account of the relationship between nationalism, racism, translation, and language. And it's on those issues I want to draw out today. Now, this work is extended across many books and essays. Two books are worth noting: Voices of the Past and Translation Subjectivity, which I think are simply seminal works today. I also wanted to mention among his many essays, an essay on Tanabe Hajime, on the logic of species, which I think fits with some of the other questions that we might pursue in this context today. Finally, I should point out that Naoki was the senior editor and founder of a really important journal project known as Traces, which was designed in many ways to put into action his theory of heterolingual address by creating a forum in which people would be translating between multiple languages, not quite in real time, but at least developing a dialogue in multiple languages that wouldn't privilege the flow of theory from the West and raw data from other parts of the world. So in many ways, he's also been active in putting his ideas into action. Now, for the format today, we have about an hour. I'm going to ask him questions for about 30 minutes and then open the floor. I wanted to thank both Chris Trujillo as well as the students working with him for the questions. I've morphed them a bit, but many of them are actually what students were interested in hearing about today. So by way of introduction, I wanted to start with a really general question to you, Naoki. One of the hallmarks of your theory of translation has been to call attention to the production of subjectivity, and above all, national subjectivities, through what you call the schema of co-figuration. I wondered if we could begin by hearing more about how you arrived at this approach and the specific conceptual resonance you wish to evoke with the terms schema and co-figuration.
Thank you, Tom. It's so nice to come back to Chicago, where I would say my studies started, together with all the problems I have to deal with even now. So, yes. As I explained in my translation and subjectivity, of course, idea of schema comes, itself is nothing sort of special. It is the most sort of a traditional or classical notion in modern European philosophy, and it comes from Kant. But I was interested in question of configuration in understanding, for instance, the formation of something like national language, or national language usually implies some kind of community of people who share some kind of common substance. In some cases, it's called language. In other, it's called culture. And then in a different context, it can be ethnicity. And then in modern world, it's called nationality. And instead of thinking about how this kind of a sense of integrity or unity is formed within the people who share that kind of entity or identity, I started thinking the other way around. No, in fact, it has very little to do with how people in one group identify with that group. Rather, the whole question is how unrelated people begin to identify certain others as such. And then, of course, this viewpoint came from my study of 18th century East Asia, where I think there, I was very surprised that there was a very, very radical, almost a revolution in the mode of translation in early or late 17th and early 18th century. And it was initiated by a Confucian scholar. He's a quite famous, Ogyu Sorai. And then until then, in places like Japan, the mode of reading, writing, speaking, and so forth was understood in reference to Kanbun Kundoku, meaning written classical Chinese text approached by sort of local people who could not actually pronounce or read original classical Chinese characters. Yeah? So in order to understand the classical Chinese texts, such as Confucian classics of the ancient period, they try to add all sorts of linguistic and then textual devices into the original text. And usually this mode of reading is called Kanbun Kundoku. And what is marvelous about Ogyu Sorai is that Ogyu Sorai called Kanbun Kundoku, this is not the way we should read. This is not reading. This is not the way we approach classical text, and completely rejected. Instead, what he said was, if you want to understand classical Confucian classical text, you should just understand it as if you understood everyday parlance among your folks in everyday context. But of course, in the early 18th century, there was no such thing as a common language in Japan. That is to say, if you go to the next village, of course, these people spoke different language, and then very often they couldn't understand what they were talking about. And in addition, Ogyu Sorai thought about the classical Chinese society, an ideal society. But the China in the 18th century was even worse. There was no such coherent and homogeneous linguistic milieu. And there was no notion of, for instance, Chinese language itself. Of course, as many of you know, the Chinese language was actually 20th century invention. Modern Chinese intellectuals worked very hard to create what we today refer to Putonghua, and which is the standard Chinese language. But in order to do that, they had to go through drastic changes. So instead, Ogyu Sorai idealized that 25 centuries ago, there was ideal community in ancient China that was completely coherent, unitary, and then homogeneous. And then this Ogyu Sorai called the reign of original emperors, that the mythical emperors in Confucianism. And then he idealized such a language. And from this, he concluded, since 25 centuries ago, the languages have deteriorated and continue to deteriorate. Therefore, reading the classical text means going back to the 25 centuries ago. And then this way, he really created a completely new method of hermeneutics, so to say, or introduced completely different way of translating classical texts. Thereby, Ogisorai really emphasized that the students have to learn how to pronounce classical Chinese and how to behave like classical Chinese, and how to learn the rituals and then habits and so forth of classical Chinese society. But this way, it was in fact provided by completely new way of translation method, which I called, well, somebody called the modern regime of translation. And here, Ogisorai's idea of language is precisely by contrasting with the idealized image of ancient Chinese language, which is unitary and completely coherent, in contrast to which you can understand different languages, such as Japanese. Of course, the Japanese as such didn't exist, but variety of variation, for instance, colloquial speech of Tokyo or Edo at that time. That's Edo, where Ogisorai taught in his private academy. So this way, he created whole idea of new translation and new hermeneutics. But immediately, not Confucian scholars, some Japanese kokugaku Meiterist scholars picked up exactly this idea and tried to show that, in fact, there must have been idealized, original, illiterate Japanese language long time before Japan was invaded by Chinese civilization. And this was exactly how they, for the first time, invented the idea, or it's in a sense schema, that is image of Japanese language. But when invented the schema of Japanese language was dead. It was postulated in a long time ago. And simply because it's a kind of essentially anti-Chinese gesture. But one thing very, very important, I think this is later related, the topic of racism, is that at that time, there was no international world in East Asia, or particularly Northeast Asia. Therefore, opposition between Japan and China could not be construed in terms of binary opposition between Chinese language and then Japanese language. And in fact, Ogisorai said, Japanese reading, writing, and so forth is not really reading or writing, because it's simply a mixture of all different linguistic elements. There is no coherence, no homogeneity. Therefore, he really tried to reject it. And the situation drastically changed in the 19th century when Japan began to deal with Europe, because by mid-19th century, Europe was already organized as an international word, meaning it's a word in which different individuated units, usually we call nation or languages, coexisted. Therefore, it was international word, unlike Northeast Europe. So I hope this might open up some questions, particularly because this is related to the question of racism. I actually began to study seriously at Chicago when I was at the University of Chicago. And this is, in fact, very closely related to the disciplines of, on the one hand, comparative literature, and then area studies on the other. All right. This is just the beginning, sorry. Yes.
No, that's excellent. And it leads into my next question, because you began to broach the matter of the international world, or what some people would even call global order or empire. And I was actually thinking a lot of your theory of the modern regime of translation and the shame of co-figuration in the context of the recent events that have spurred at last this broader social awareness of anti-Asian violence. And I think of a central concern of your theory of translation being a critique of racism,
yes,
particularly a critique of racism where the shame of co-figuration makes us think about racism not simply as internal to the nation and then ignoring external relations, but actually being a configuration of the two. So I wanted to draw you out a little bit more on that aspect of your work.
Yes, thank you. In fact, I think you mentioned the whole question of anti-Asian violence in current climate. And of course, in the history of the United States or in Europe, anti-Asian racism is nothing new. Yet it's coming back now, and which is very, very interesting. Here, I would like to draw attention to the fact that term Asian is extremely broad, and it's extremely difficult to define. One reason is that, in fact, until late 19th century, there are hardly any people or any particular individuals in Asia, so-called Asia, who identified him or herself as Asian. One of the most important conditions without which individual would never identify him or herself with Asia is that, first of all, Asia is a directional adverbial, which self-reflectively defines Europe. That is to say, Europeans used to call Asians, but Asians themselves never called themselves Asian. And only in late 19th century, where majority of Asian, of course, you have places like Asia Minor, or you have Eastern Shore of Mediterranean Sea, and so forth. These areas, the term Asia was widely used, but in 19th century, the use of Asia expanded, starting with places like Turkey and Eastern Shore of Mediterranean, all the way to China, and then Southeast Asia, and eventually Japan. So Asia is a broad region, and in order for an individual living in Asia to identify him or herself with Asia, first thing he or she has to do is to take up the perspective of Europeans. That is to say, you pretend you are European and view the eastern part of the east of Europe as Asia. And then you reflectively locate your own position in Asia. So Asian identity itself is, importantly, incorporates the structure of Europe versus Asia. And as a matter of fact, the same structure can be traced, the Europe versus Africa and Europe versus Americas. And of course, the dichotomy of Europe and the rest, which I think later Stuart Hall called the discourse of the West and the rest, is exactly basic structure of modern international world, in which, in late 19th century on, it's called the West, but initially Europe meant the area where international law applied. And then the rest is the area in which international law didn't apply. What does it mean? Very immediately, Europeans are not allowed to apply crude military violence against other Europeans. Among Europeans, they create a system of political rule according to which each nation, in this case, or more specifically, a territorial state sovereignty, is protected by international law. But once outside Europe, it doesn't matter. Therefore, it occurs in Americas. Unlimited violence was applied to the local residents. And then in Asia too, unlimited violence was applied to local residents. And in Africa, similarly. And usually we call it colonialism. That is, the whole idea of Europe is, in fact, the justification for the division between Europe and the rest of the world. And Asians in the late 19th century came to realization that unless you understand this structure of modern world, you would never be able to survive, because the vast area of Asia were, in fact, colonized. So in this sense, when Asians called themselves Asians, in fact, they understood they have to integrate perspective of Europeans and then start viewing the world from the lens of Europeans. And I think this is the basic structure of modern world. In a variety of ways, people talked about it. For instance, conquest of Americas, about what happened in North and Central and South Americas after the arrival of Columbus, and then of course the conquest of for instance, India, Southeast Asia, and then eventual gradual colonization of China, and what they called opening of Japan to the West. And then Japanese intellectuals understood this part so well. Therefore, Japanese from 19th century, late 19th century onward, they really tried to imitate Europeans because they wanted to join the West. That is to say, they wanted to be treated as one of the Western nations so that they would never be would be a target of colonial violence. So, but this reflects this structure. In fact, when I first realized the question of racism in relation to area studies, and then of course the in 1980s and 70s and 80s, it was a period when I think comparative literature as discipline was undergoing drastic change. And this change was very, very closely connected with this structure of modern world, I think. Is it all right?
Thank you, Naoki. And that leads into a question that I believe a number of students wanted to hear more about, precisely your critique of the production of knowledge within universities. You mentioned the critique of area studies and the formation of comparative literature, but we'd like to hear more about your own experiences within the academy, of course, but also how you see area studies or comparative literature functioning today. Like what kind of work do you see rising to the challenge of critiquing these fields?
Yeah. Increasingly, for the last 2-3 decades, I've been engaged in the effect of area studies, not necessarily in North America or Western Europe, but increasingly in East Asia. One most important characteristics of East Asian, sort of the humanities and a bit of social sciences, is that in fact Asian intellectuals were very much integrated into this structure of viewing Asia through the perspective of Asia. And I call this civilizational transference. That is to say, area studies, for instance, postulate most typically the researcher being in the West or belonging to the West, and object of the study is Asian native, or area, it's usually called. This structure has been criticized, starting probably with people like Edward Said, Gertrude Spivak, and so forth, or Ray Chow, and you can think of a number of important figures who all appeared in comparative literature in the late 1970s and the early 80s. Yet, structure is relatively secure, not in North America, but in East Asia. East Asia still repeats exactly the same pattern of knowledge production, which means, in fact, that's why I use the term transference, psychoanalytic term, which means transference is not, for instance, the patient is afraid of analyst. Therefore, patient copies analyst wishes or try to reproduce analyst's desire. And that mode still continues in East Asia. And most typically, increasingly, so-called anti-colonial nationalism of Asia, probably you are too young to remember this, but in the 1990s, there is a very interesting sort of the debate concerning Asian values about in Malaysia. Asian values was promoted by the Prime Minister at the time of Malaysia against the European critique of variety of pre-modern institutions still operating in Southeast Asia. Instead, he wanted to defend traditional values and Asian values. But that way of defending Asian values is exactly the way, for instance, area studies, the promoted idea of tradition of area and then native population. And I started working at University of Chicago. I started working with Japanese studies, and the first phase of Japanese studies is usually called national character studies. And in early stage, that is the most typical form of area studies. Westerners visiting local places and discovering indigenous cultures and then respecting the cultural traits of indigenous people and so forth. And that form has been preserved in Asia. So I think I have been involved in the critique of this way of, I think I should I should think that it's not, area studies is no longer particular to American university education. Yes.
Yeah, that leads me to the last question I was going to ask before I open the floor to questions, and it concerns your theory of heterolingual address that you tentatively carve out in translation and subjectivity. And implicit in this, I think, is also a critique of humanism.
Yes.
I think in the contemporary context, a number of people had asked the questions about how you think heterolingual address might apply to, say, the more than human realm. Is there a way in which heterolingual address gives us some purchase in thinking about something like a heterosemiotic address to the more than human, for instance?
Yes, it's a very important issue. And let me point out the two, I think, what should I say, aspects in critique of humanism. And one aspect is concerned with the critique of how human or notion of humanity itself has constructed. That's one aspect, which has its own history, as you are fully aware. And another aspect is, as you mentioned, the differentiation between human and non-human. Right? This difference. And these two aspects are mutually related. And I think I was helped by a friend of mine, and I think he was also a friend of Tom's, John Solomon. And I used to deal with this problem in terms of notion like cultural difference, civilizational difference, colonial difference, and so forth. That is one of the most important aspects of modern thought. And I think in this, people like Michel Foucault did much work. His critique of humanism is very closely related to this. That is one of the most important motivations behind modern European thought, or in general, modern humanities, is that the identification of European humanities against non-European humanities. You find this argument one again, repeatedly. And most recent, the most naked form of discussion about European humanity comes with late Edmund Husserl. And it's ironical because when he talked about this European humanity, he was actually the victim of racial racism against non-European. That is to say, at that time, Nazi used Jewry as a most symbolic expression of non-European humanities. And he was, of course, Jewish. Therefore, he was excluded from European academia. Yet, very sadly, the last phase of his phenomenology is devoted to elaboration about how European humanity is different from non-European humanities. And in this, John Solomon suggested that term anthropological difference. And this anthropological difference is traditionally in, for instance, in comparative literature and then academic humanities, it's usually used two different sort of the, what should I say, terms. In modern human sciences, European humanities is usually called humanitas, again, Latin term. And the non-European humanity is usually called anthropos. As you can see, the most typical use of anthropos can be found, anthropology. And then anthropology is exactly a kind of human science which humanitas studies anthropos, thereby establishing the difference between humanitas and anthropos. And this structure was inherited by area studies. And then today, of course, for the last 2-3 centuries, this structure cannot be maintained because in your sort of the East Asian languages and civilizations, right? You have so many Chinese, Indians, and Koreans, and Taiwanese, Vietnamese, and so forth, students. But when I first entered area studies in the 1980s, probably Tom remembers vividly, usually in the entire class, I was the only Asian student. I remember vividly. So there are very, very few Asian studies working on area studies. And then today, I think it is not merely a kind of sort of the problems against the discrimination rate Asian Americans, but I think it's very fundamental. It is related to the basic structure of knowledge production in modern international world.
Well, I'd like to take a brief pause and invite other people to ask questions if they'd like to. As I wrote in chat, you can send a question in by chat, or again, Chris, I'm not sure how this is configured, if people could just speak up.
Yeah, so people should feel free to either write their questions in chat or to raise their hand, and Thomas, you can call on them.
Should I read chat, or probably the easiest way is to, if anybody can raise hand, and yeah, that's much more direct.
Well, if people are still waiting, Naoki, I did have one question.
Okay.
No, two questions came in. So let me start with Alia.
Okay.
Hi, sorry, I just got my vaccine, so I've had my video off, but I've been listening with rapt attention. So I completely connect with what you're saying about knowledge production in area studies, and how certain tropes seem to get sort of incessantly repeated regardless of which side of the Pacific you're working from. And I was wondering whether you know of any scholars or any particular books or any conferences, any genre of academic knowledge production that works to undermine some of these tropes, anything that you feel is kind of effectively breaking down some of these familiar narratives.
Of course, I mentioned people like Edward Said, Gertrude Spivak, Ray Chow, and a number of others who contributed the transformation of the discipline of comparative literature. And I think in many ways, I think these scholars struggle with this problem. And even though they did not launch the overall sort of the critique of the discipline of comparative literature as such. In contrast to comparative literature, until recently, area studies has been extremely conservative. I was fortunate because in 1980s, the University of Chicago was probably only place where the critique of area studies was permitted. So in the sense, I have to be very, very grateful to my teachers, such as Harry Harutunian, and then in a different mode, Masao Miyoshi, and then recently died Tetsuo Najita, and so forth. And then, of course, I was very fortunate that I was with my fellow students, including Tom, but another very important student with whom I really started study of racism and area studies is William Haber, who used to teach at Binghamton, State University of Binghamton, but now he has retired. So in this sense, yes, I think in a potential mode, I think I can think of a number of scholars in area studies who are aware of this problem and then approaching this problem from different angles. But I haven't encountered any sort of the overall critique of area studies, except in Taku Fujitani's Race for Empire. Not directly, but he is very much aware of the importance of knowledge production in understanding power. So, and then, so you can think of a number of important scholars in this respect. Yeah.
Yes, Hang, you also had a question?
Hi, Professor Sakai. I have a question about, actually, because since the title of this conversation is the politics of translation in pandemic, I have a question related to the pandemic. The reason why the pandemic becomes global is that there are like accelerated circulation of things and human. And then I was just wondering, like, you mentioned that there's a distance between the object of study, which is like areas like East Asia, and people who studies those areas, usually people in North America or in Europe. I was just wondering, like, how does the basis or the infrastructure basis that makes possible this kind of accelerated circulation of viruses, people, and things that challenge the foundation of what is traditionally has been historically structured area studies, which is the kind of like distance between informants and analysts, you know what I mean? So I was just thinking about how does area study in like today takes up the challenge posed by our time? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's a very interesting question. And then, well, everybody talks about it. This pandemic, a similar pandemic occurred 100 years ago, right? Spanish flu. And it happened immediately after World War I. And then, as you can see, in fact, that series, if we take the trope of pandemic a bit more broadly, and then it opens to the period of emergence of fascist resurgence, or emergence of resurgence of fascism, or white supremacy. One of the reasons why this white supremacy rhetoric appears immediately after First World War is that First World War is said to mean the collapse of international world, modern international world, in which the West or Europe and the rest of the world was very clearly separated. Because First World War, well, many intellectuals from India and Africa commented about First World War and Second World War II as well, is that these two wars were occasions where Europeans were treated as if they were non-Europeans. That is to say, colonial violence was applied to Europeans. That is, secure barrier that separated Europeans from non-European collapsed. As a result, the Europeans' most immediate reaction to this situation was to naturalize or essentialize the European identity. And of course, traditionally, the most essentialized form of European identity can be found in the notion of race. What is happening today is exactly the same thing. That is to say, what prompted this situation is tremendous anxiety of so-called white people who were no longer sure that they were differentiated from non-Europeans. And to that extent, you can explain why Asian Americans became target, even though idea of Asia does not show any specific context. So I am very hesitant to do that. But increasingly, in terms of cultural capital, in terms of scientific rationality, in terms of political shrewdness, in terms of accumulation of industrial production, and so forth, all these factors that used to be used to explain so-called modernization, and in which the so-called West is always above Africa, Americas, and then Asia in terms of scientific rationality, economic wealth, and so forth. This notion of modernization or classification of modernization cannot be sustained any longer. It gives rise to amazing anxiety among those who have taken granted that these hierarchical measures, according to which I return to the term, anthropological difference has been essentialized, today is suffering from tremendous anxiety. And this explains why some symbolic figures like Trump, why can he be able, can he attract so much attention? He has nothing to give, yet he appeals to the huge number of people occupying certain social positions. And it is precisely that now international world, modern international world is in crisis. And then you have to remember, Nazism was exactly the response to this sense of crisis in 1920s and 30s. And then I mentioned Edmund Husserl. It's a very, very sad story, yet the Husserl did not see the structure of the whole rhetoric of European humanities. Well, his posthumous last book is called Crisis of Crisis of European Humanities and Transcendental Phenomenology, and in which he really tried to show Europeans must not be like Indians or Chinese. Okay.
Yes, Paula, would you like to this question.
Oh,
Hi.
hi. Long time no see.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great to see you. I was just wondering if in this, especially in the crisis in which we're in, or in more in general in the last few years, you've seen new dynamics of interaction with Asia-based scholars, and also new ideas emerging from Asia. What, for instance, I'm thinking of the notion of Asia as method by Quan-Xin Chen, and more generally, I mean, today I've heard you speak about area studies, and then certain destructive habits of area studies being also adopted in Asia in the form of embrace of Asian values and so on. I'm just wondering if you see any other possibilities of knowledge production, especially in Asia, and especially now with the whole dynamics between East and West being really shaken over the last few years.
Yeah, I understand it's a very urgent problem, even though I would never endorse Chen Guangxin's approach. I would rather call it the most typical case of civilizational transference. That is to say, he is not fully aware to what extent he was internalizing Eurocentric structure of area studies. And then, so his argument is very similar to the argument of Asian values. That is, so I would rather avoid, or I would rather criticize such approach, because he borrowed the idea of Asian method from Takeuchi Yoshimi, Japanese sinologist, because the Takeuchi Yoshimi's essays became available in English just a few years before that book appeared, because Richard Kalikman, probably you remember, he used to be a graduate student at Cornell, translated that book. So I don't think he really struggled with Takeuchi Yoshimi. But it is true, there are new moves. But again, one of the barriers we have to overcome is that, in my understanding, is that, first of all, area studies has been traditionally very, very hesitant to deal with theoretical questions. There is a very inherent tendency within area studies against theoretical approaches. And one thing we really have to overcome is this, what should I say, hatred of theory in Asia, area studies. And in this sense, we really have to learn much from comparative literature. Because I think we understand the comparative literature today as one for the last several decades, one of the most productive source of theoretical investigation in the humanities.
Thank you.
Jueho?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Sakai, for this talk. I was actually in the FUTH workshop at Cornell 5 years ago, Future of Humanities and Anthropological Difference. And that was also part of your project to overcome this areas, the flaws of area studies. So I guess I have a question. Sorry, it's I'm in Beijing, China right now, so it's and it's 5 a.m. in the morning, so I might be talking nonsense. Apologies in advance. In the past year, I've been thinking about this issue of scholarly subjectivity, which is where we speak from as a scholar ourselves, not only as not only our objects of studies. And I've been recently reading Professor Sun Ge, Chinese scholar of Japan, I think with whom you did a book on area studies. Right. And I was really, I had the very strong impression when she said at some point that since modern times, Japan has been a transparent medium through which China has imported Western learning, and to such an extent that in a way, Japan has become a transparent entity. And for a Chinese scholar to engage Japan as an object of study, we have to recognize first Japan as an independent and entity in itself, instead of a transparent medium between China and the rest of the world. And I think it strikes me as it's very interesting because it certainly sounds very counterintuitive to an American scholar for whom I guess Japan would be anything but transparent, would be the other. And so I've been thinking how Chinese scholars of Japan studies and Japan studies in North America have really different starting points, and how in a way this personal aspect really comes into play when we engage our object of studies. And I've also been reading Joseph North with Paula's reading group actually last year, Literary Criticism, A Concise Political History, where he criticizes this notion of historicist contextualist paradigm of literary research, and where I guess academic rigor really translates into this imperative to be impartial, impersonal, and for a scholar to really possess no, I guess, personal position and personal background. And I wonder if this speaks to the current problems we're facing in area studies, whether this so-called academic rigor that suppresses, I guess, the personal aspect of scholarship that we all have to confront in our study. And I also do think Chen Guangxin's project of Asia's method really comes out of a misreading, or not necessarily misreading, of Takeuchi Yoshimi, because I think Takeuchi really, when he approaches Lu Xun as his subject, he really is perfectly aware of his own identity as a Japanese, a citizen, and he is really thinking through. I think he's really using Lu Xun as a method for thinking, for his own thinking on Japan. And so I guess I just want to ask about this personal, the personal versus the scholarly, and academic rigor versus, I don't know, this scholarly subjectivity. Sorry, I might not be making sense.
No, thank you. Yeah, it's a very insightful question, I think. Let me avoid my friend Sunge, because 2 years ago I published a book with in which her talk and my talk put together, but there's no common ground between us. So what I think you mentioned is related to the whole process of modernization in East Asia. That is to say, modernization is always introduced figuratively. Let me just explain. For instance, in late 19th century, when Japanese intellectuals tried to create Japanese language, institution of Japanese language. It's a national language. They didn't rely upon Chinese tradition or Chinese text at all. Instead, what they did was to translate French literature, English history, German philosophy, and in that process, they tried to create something equivalent to European languages, or French, English, and so forth. Thereby, as an equivalent to European entity, they created Japanese entity called Japanese language. Therefore, it's configurative creation. And I think Chinese intellectuals essentially follow the same thing. Of course, incited by Japanese intellectuals, but what they tried to create was Chinese language that can be almost equivalent to English. Therefore, in their attempt to create Chinese language, you find amazing parallelism between English language, syntax, or pronunciations, and then morphology, and so forth. And then Putonghua, the proposed idea. That is how the distinction, or what Stuart Hall called dichotomy or discourse of the West and the rest operated. First, there's a West, and the rest must be formed according to the image of the West. And this is exactly the structure of knowledge production in area studies. So what I've been trying to do is how to get out, find a way to get out from this structure. And instead of talking about something like the West, as if there is a sort of an integral entity called West, we might as well pay attention to the amazing diversity that exists within the West. And recently, it's almost a joke, but you recall the whole word Anglo-Saxon was proposed, and which immediately created embarrassment within the Republican circle. Well, if you want to introduce Anglo-Saxon, do you want to stop treating Irish or Italian as white? Should Italians or East Europeans stop being European? Until 1950s, word Anglo-Saxon worked precisely that way, right? To exclude some immigrants from Europe as if they belong to non-Europe. That is to say, idea of West itself is not well established. The identity of so-called whiteness itself is in fact very, very arbitrary. So in this sense, we really have to pay attention to the historicities of, for instance, racism. And so many people mention that in the 19th century, Irish were not white. Yet people tend to forget how, arbitrary the idea of Westerner or white or European itself is. And it's constantly changing. And likewise, I think Asian, identity of Asian will continue to change. And then I'd like to pay attention to this constant transformation of these racial identities, but racial identities work in accordance with the transformation of other sorts of identities.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Do we have time for one more question? I see that.
Yeah, I would say maybe we can end with Jen's question. That's perfectly fine, Thomas.
Okay.
Hello.
Please. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't unmute myself. Thank you very much for this discussion and for your work. I've been working on a book about translingual poetry and post-fascism for about 10 years, and your work has been really important to me as I've been undertaking this. So my question is really about the structure of the university and how academic structures can then be more true to the way that languages actually work and the way that even literature actually works. So one of the reasons it's taken me so long to write this book is that it doesn't sit in an area study very, very well, and that the authors themselves, having written between languages, such as, say, English, French, and Italian, or Arabic and French, they are not accepted within the national academies, let's say, of so-called national literatures. So how can we restructure the academy so as to do justice to the particularities, but also to the continuum between one language and the next, and the interchange between one language and another that is more and more on display in the literature of today? I work on experimental poetry, so these are poets who aren't afraid to mix languages or use neologisms or to kind of invent the way that people do when they're speaking. I know it's one that you're sort of always answering, but I still feel that there are so many blockades to this kind of project because of the sort of territorialism implicit and in, different national literatures establishments, and the risk of sort of seeming like you're going outside your range of mastery, or the risk of seeming like you're working on someone who has appropriated another language instead of merely speaking it. I don't know if that makes sense as a question. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Actually, I've been working on a similar programs, but probably the other way around. That is to say, before, for instance, poetry, idea or image of Japanese language was established in late 19th century, usually around 1890s. Before 1890s, there was no such established image of Japanese language. But of course, poetry has been produced since the probably 8th, 7th centuries, because the written forms survived. At that time, poetry was always, well, it's a wrong way to say it, but always mixing different languages. Without mixing different languages, it was impossible to write or sing or read or speak. In this respect, I recently, well, not recently, about a decade ago, a friend of mine wrote a brilliant book on Ferdinand Saussure, a very famous linguist from Geneva, and was astonishing. The last part of courses on general linguistics, just before he died, he gave a general linguistics in which he said something astounding. He studied the question of what he called dialective features, or what should I say, dialectical characters, characteral dialectal. And he said, yes, if you, for instance, in places like Switzerland or in southern France, if you just travel a few miles, you discover different dialectical features. And then you can draw maps of dialectical features. But he said, it is impossible to draw maps of dialects, because no dialect is an entity. And every language has many, essentially infinite number of dialectical features. Therefore, it is logically impossible to say, here, there is one dialect, and there is another dialect, and there is another dialect. So from this, he completely denied concept of dialect. And then next step, he said, if you can talk about dialect, you can talk about language in general. There are no such thing as languages. In Europe, tremendous dialectic diversity exists, but there is no such thing as French, German, English, and so forth. Of course, he didn't say such an important role has been played by discipline of linguistics in modern Europe. In other words, knowledge production is really the source of political power. So it seems to me that you are touching upon that issue. So I'm now dealing with the whole question of how something like national language came to exist. And then without massive reorganization of knowledge production in humanities, and then to a lesser extent, social sciences, it is probably impossible to appreciate the notions such as national languages.
Thank you.
Naoki, thank you for that answer as well as the whole dialogue. I wish we could continue on. I know there's lots more questions. It's been delightful and really instructive to hear from you. But we are going to end here, right? I think we've reached time, and I hope we'll have another opportunity.
Yes, well, Tom, you are coming to Cornell, so.
That's right.
But other students might not, I don't know, you might connect to the link.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you to both of you again. Thank you so much, Naoki, for such thought-provoking comments, and thank you, Tom, for leading this conversation as well. And thank you for the audience as well for being here, for staying a little bit over. It's great to see everybody, and I hope that you all take care in the meantime. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you. And thank you very much for giving me such a nice opportunity.
I just wanted to say thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I've been reading your work together with many of the figures you mentioned throughout your talk today, and it was really great to get a chance to hear you speak about them, especially as someone who's a joint degree student in comparative literature in the ALC.
Oh, I see. Okay, yes.
Yeah, but I know you're exhausted after this. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you. All right.
All right, great, guys. Thanks so much. That was so terrific. I think that was such a wonderful turnout.
Well, and thank you too for organizing.
Yeah.
You pulled it off.
No, it was my pleasure. And we thank you, Ingrid, so much for taking care of all the technical stuff at the beginning as well.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Well, happy Friday. Have a great weekend.
Have a good weekend.
Yes.
Sorry, a little bit of the glitchiness at the beginning, and I'm still kind of figuring out how to do multiple people in the screen. So I appreciate your being.
No, thanks so much, Ingrid.
Yes.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.